The Mono is one of those cars that you'd probably have expected me to review earlier than this, probably fairly early on after Gran Turismo 7's release in fact, but for one reason or another it just kind of got away from me, and it is a car which is very easy to see why people were excited for it, because not only is it a tremendously quick car anyway, but also it's a very significant new one to have in GT7 as a day one vehicle, and it was featured quite a lot, quite frequently in the promo footage and trailers for Gran Turismo 7, and it is a tremendous car on paper. Over 300 horsepower, Cosworth power of course, single-seater, mid-engine rear-wheel drive, very Formula Ford-esque, very Formula 1 car for the street, and if a car can be even more focused, even more hardcore than something like an Ariel Atom, well that's saying a lot. Now these are very expensive cars in real life, and they're very expensive in the game as well. In fact, this car is about a hair off of $250,000 credits. Now obviously you can earn $250,000 pretty easily in Gran Turismo, but the point remains that that's quite a lot for a single-seater track day toy, and of course part of the reason why, much like in real life, is because it is that much more exotic than most small open-wheel style cars like a Caterham or an Atom tend to be. This is decidedly less kit car and decidedly more supercar, and in terms of performance it definitely is as well, but in more ways than one, because on the one hand, with over 300 horses and only 580 kilos, it is as quick as many supercars, and here at Road Atlanta you'll see me keeping up with many supercars, and it can certainly do that for many players. It also has an element of supercar in there as well in terms of getting the best out of it, because I actually find this car to be in some ways kind of the opposite to what you'd expect on handling. You would typically assume that a small, super lightweight, open-wheel car with, at least at first glance, relatively minimal thought to downforce, and more of a thought to just having the weight as low as possible, although on this occasion it does have a lot more downforce than many smaller track day cars do, it's a car which you'd kind of expect to be maybe a bit twitchy, bit slippery, and more so in the same vein as the aforementioned Atoms and Caterhams. And of course there are a wide variety of other options as well, your Grinnell Scorpions, your Derondas, various other brands, many of them more obscure, but it's kind of the opposite. So if you throw this thing into a corner, it actually suffers from quite a lot of understeer, at least for about 50% of the curve, and then on the way out of the corner, that's when your typical oversteer kicks in and that back end will step out. Now it's a car that doesn't have a huge amount of tuning available to it, at least in terms of increasing the power, but I think for most players you probably won't be too bothered by that. It's not really the kind of car that you're going to try and beat a Veyron with in a straight line. This car's forte is of course on the track. That's what it's designed for, that's what it's good at, and it is completely focused on that task. It's just, for me, I don't know what it is, but there's something about the Mono that has never really captured my attention in the same way that many do, and I know I'm an outlier here, very much so, because this seems to be a widely loved car that I just don't really get on with that much. I barely ever use it, and I don't really like it that much, but I think that's more so because I'm just not a huge fan of this kind of car in general, the smaller track day toy. Again, I know for a petrol head that's a weird thing to say, these are kind of like a distilled down essence of what driving high performance cars is all about, so I'm sure I'd have a lot of fun in one in real life, but in games I find them a bit too obvious. You know, cars like this, they kind of do what you'd expect them to do, and there's not really too much charisma or personality or flair. They're kind of just a tool to get the job done. Now on that point, if that's what you're looking for, it most definitely does that. This car definitely gets the job done, especially, and this is where lightweight track cars really come into their own, when the power is restricted. And I don't mean necessarily reducing it from the stock power even less, I'm talking about restricted events. See, if you race this thing up against full-on supercars, as I am here, 700 horsepower Aventadors, 700 horsepower Huayras, 600 horsepower Carrera GTs, etc., well, it can, at least under certain circumstances, beat them, especially on a track where there are more corners than straights. However, if you limit those cars to this level of power, even if you make those cars lighter, they're going to struggle a lot more against a car like this, and that really is where it comes into its own. In a funny kind of way, I really wish we'd have had this car in Gran Turismo Sport, because I think that in Gran Turismo Sport with the N-Class system, this car would have been a beast. In fact, it kind of is in some ways the spiritual successor, at least from what I've seen, to the light car company Rocket in Gran Turismo 6. It's not quite as crazy as that one, because that's about half the power again, but it's similar. Similar vein, similar single-seater layout, certainly has a similar approach to being that formula car for the street. But in Gran Turismo Sport's N-Class systems, this would have been a monster. N300 this would have been, and you could have easily detuned it to N200, and what a machine this would have been in either of those classes. Now though, in GT7, well, of course it makes a lot more sense. Much like the Red Bull Junior and various other smaller cars, the total lack of weight, the sheer cornering ability, of course ramps up the points, to the point where this one, for example, is over 645 points, even on the completely stock setup with sports medium tyres. And of course, just changing it to racing tyres immediately rockets those points way, way up, even without touching the power at all. So it's a car that I would say doesn't really offer anything that's going to surprise you. It's not like you're going to buy this and go, oh wow, I never knew this was going to do what it could do. Well, of course, it does everything you think it's going to do, and that's why it's good, it's why it's popular, and it's why it's fast. So for me, it's a fairly simple review in terms of, well, yeah, it just does what it says on the tin. And I guess in real life, that's why people like it as well, coupled with that extra layer of exclusivity and exoticness that it has as well on top, compared to those more traditional kit car style rivals which it's often put up against. To me, I would describe the Mono as being more on the level of something like a Caparo T1 rather than, say, a kit car like a Caterham. And that might be a fairly obvious statement to make, but to me it is decidedly more on the exotic end of that spectrum. Now for that, I do respect it, and I really like that they went for that. It's just something about the car itself doesn't quite do it for me. So I don't personally use this one that much in Gran Turismo 7, but I could certainly see a lot of people doing so. And in terms of tuning, it's fairly obvious where this car is really going to come into its own. Any circuit where you can make full use of that cornering ability, and especially its cornering speeds, ideally, if you are power restricted as well, that is really where this thing is a weapon. Ultimately though, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, add yours down below, either for or against what I've said about the car. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Maybe are you a bit like me and just don't really use it that much? Either way, tell me down below, and of course, I'll see you next time with more. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.